In this next video, I will demonstrate how to render our fur sphere. My chosen fur is tiger fur. Let's get started. In Project 3, we will be practicing how to render form and communicate texture through a variety of mark making. Okay, all you cool cats and kittens, this is my photo reference. Be sure you're working from a clear, high-resolution photograph. For a painting like this, begin with a limited color palette. You might be asking yourself, where do I start? Which color should I pick? It's a good idea to simply ask yourself, what is the local color of my subject matter? In my case, I'm painting tiger fur, so I'm going to start with orange. Next, I need to consider how I'm going to cool, darken, and dull down my orange to communicate shadows. The easiest way for me to do that would be to simply add blue. In this case, I've chosen Prussian blue from my set. Lastly, I've picked out colors to help me communicate highlights. In this case, I've picked yellow ochre to lighten and brighten my orange. I have also selected the color called light red from the Shinhan set. I will be using this color to bring out the red tones in the fur and to also warm up my highlights. And of course, I will also be using pure black and white. I will be using the black to communicate the stripes and the white to further lighten my highlights. The light violet color you see, also called heliotrope in the Shinhan set, will be used for my reflected lights. We will talk more about those later. We will begin by painting an underpainting, composed of darker midtones. This underpainting will help us establish a foundation to build our texture on. I will be using light red mixed with Prussian blue to achieve my desired tone. In my underpainting, I want to establish where my basic lights and shadows will go. So I will be adding a little bit of orange to this mixture as well, just to mark where my highlights go. You don't want your underpainting to get too thick. Feel free to use more water in this mixture. Using an H pencil and a circle guide, I have lightly marked where my sphere will go. I will be using a wet into wet technique to establish my underpainting. I will wet my surface with a clean, damp brush. Do your best to stay within the lines. Using the colors I mixed for my underpainting, I will establish where my basic lights and shadows will go. I am using one of my larger brushes to quickly lay down my tones. This will also keep me from overworking my painting and scrubbing at my board. It is better to go darker than you think for this underpainting. And don't worry if your painting doesn't look perfect at this point. Again, you are more just giving yourself a foundation to work on. Using the black straight out of the jar, I will simply mark where my stripes will go. Notice I'm starting to pay attention to form and following the curve of the sphere. If I was feeling apprehensive, I could have let my painting dry, and then using pencil, draw in my stripes, and then later paint them in. Let your underpainting thoroughly dry before moving on to the next step. Now it's finally time to start establishing some texture and rendering form. I can start by recycling some of my colors from my underpainting. I am concentrating on mixing colors that are found in some of my midtones and in the core shadow. On the left side of my palette, I am adding orange, yellow ochre, and white to lighten and brighten some of my midtones. The color I'm mixing on the right side will be used in the core shadow. I am adding a little bit of white to thicken it up and increase the opacity, and I'm adding a tiny bit of blue to dull, darken, and cool this tone. Let's begin building up this texture on top of our underpainting. Looking at my photo reference, I can see that tigers have short, coarse fur. This will give me a hint as to what kind of mark to make to communicate this texture. So I will be using one of my smaller brushes, as well as small hatch marks. Even though I'm using small hatch marks, I'm still paying attention to the curve of the sphere and allowing my hatch marks to kind of hug the curve of the sphere. Otherwise, if my hatch marks were too parallel and straight, I'll end up with something that looks like a screen door and very flat, not reminiscent of fur at all. In this portion of the painting, I am establishing my midtones and core shadow. I am ignoring the stripes for now. Now I want to start establishing some of my brightest, lightest highlights. Using my mid-tone mixture from earlier, I will add white and yellow ochre to lighten and brighten. Remember, it's okay to test your colors on a piece of scrap, or do a couple of marks on your actual painting, let it dry, and then decide if it's correct. Using this mixture, I will paint in my highlights. This will further establish that furry texture. Most of my highlights are located in the top, front, right-hand side of the sphere. Remember not to go too crazy with your mark making. You want to allow some of your underpainting to show through. That's how we establish texture. Don't panic if your board starts to warp or even bubble like you see here. It will flatten out once it dries. It's finally time to establish my stripes. For the areas in highlight, I have mixed a warm black, and for the stripes going into my core shadow, I have mixed a cool black. Notice with my mark making on the stripes, I am still continuing to follow the form of the sphere and allowing my marks to kind of wrap around the sphere. Oops, we've made a mistake. We can clean this up using a clean, damp brush. Using your damp, clean brush, you can simply smudge out the mistake. With a light hand, blend it into the surrounding areas. Lastly, we need to consider our reflected lights. For my reflected lights, I will be using a dull mid-tone violet. For this mixture, I will be using the heliotrope from the Shinhan set, as well as recycling some of the colors I have mixed for my core shadows. I will also add a little bit of white just to lighten it up a bit. Remember, you want your reflected lights to be lighter than your core shadow, but darker than your highlights. That reflected light is going to run just along the bottom of the sphere. Remember, your reflected light can be really any color of your choice. that's just about it, guys. Remember, I recommend starting with the fur sphere. It's the more forgiving of the textures. Let's give it a try.